Baghdad, 9th century. No microscopes, no telescopes, no test tubes. Yet a city hums like a power station for ideas. Inside the fabled House of Wisdom, knowledge doesn't arrive as a miracle, it's built. Couriers slip in with manuscripts from Byzantium, Persia, and India. Teams swarm them, translators, editors, mathematicians, moving pages through a precision workflow where every claim is tested, every term nailed down, every table checked. What looks like a library is more like an engine. Greek astronomy is recast for prayer clocks and calendars. Sanskrit numbers become tools for accountants and architects. Legal minds borrow logic from philosophers. Physicians update recipes from clinic notes. The result isn't random genius, it's coordinated breakthroughs. Algebra with rules you can teach, optics that forces light to confess its path, and handbooks that let a surveyor in Kufa solve the same problem as a builder in Basra. This is the Golden Age behind the legend. Not just inspiration, but execution. Budgets, schedules, catalogs, copyists, and a city designed to move ideas faster than caravans. If you think civilization was built by lone prodigies, wait until you see the system that turned curiosity into power and changed the world page by page. Before the Golden Age, the map around Arabia looked like a patchwork. Byzantium held Anatolia and the Levant, speaking Greek and ruling from Constantinople. The Sasanian Persians controlled Mesopotamia and Iran with their own administrative systems and Zoroastrian clergy. North African towns shifted between Berber chieftains and imperial garrisons. In Arabia, trade oases like Mecca and Yathrib sat along caravan routes linking Indian Ocean goods to Mediterranean ports. Tribes negotiated alliances, protected wells, and recited poetry as public record and entertainment. Law was customary, honor-based, and local. Languages overlapped at borders, and merchants learned enough phrases to haggle and move on. In the 7th century, Islam introduced a clear center of gravity. The Quran standardized recitation in Arabic, and that language began to serve for law, diplomacy, and ritual. The community formed around a shared creed and a disciplined routine of prayer, fasting, and charity. Prophet Muhammad led as a statesman as well as a messenger, forging agreements between clans in Medina, issuing judgments, and sending letters to neighboring rulers. That model linked faith with administration and trade ethics, giving caravans rules for contracts and trust, and pushing disputes from vendetta to arbitration. After his passing, the Rashidun caliphs extended that order quickly through campaigns that combined negotiation, treaties, and force. They kept tax registers, secured roads, and installed judges who applied a growing body of legal reasoning. Cities such as Kufa and Basra became garrisons and then markets, attracting craftsmen and scholars. Under the Umayyads, Damascus coordinated a wider system from Spain to the Indus. Arabic became the language of the chancery, and coinage adopted standardized inscriptions. Mosques doubled as communal halls and learning spaces, with teachers instructing in scripture, law, and grammar. Architecture began to signal authority with domes, courtyards, and minarets that also marked time through the call to prayer. Knowledge flowed into this network. Administrators collected Greek, Persian, and Indian works that had practical value: astronomy for calendars, mathematics for inheritance and surveying, medicine for hospitals, and adab literature for courtly conduct. Early translators and scribes in Damascus and later in Kufa rendered key texts into Arabic, sometimes through Syriac intermediaries. Astronomical handbooks circulated to improve prayer times and lunar months, and star names entered Arabic lists. Indian numerals started to gain ground among accountants who wanted cleaner arithmetic than abacus-led tallies. Learning centers formed before Baghdad rose to fame. In Medina, circles of hadith transmitters refined methods for verifying reports. In Damascus, secretaries trained in bilingual offices managed tax districts and cataloged documents. Sermons and scholarly sessions used clear Arabic, which encouraged grammarians to codify rules and preserve poetry that anchored vocabulary and rhetoric. Mecca's markets brought foreign goods and stories, and caravans crossing the Hijaz carried both spices and ideas. In Damascus, bazaars sold silk and metalwork, while nearby workshops copied manuscripts for patrons who wanted compact, readable codices. Early Muslim authorities preserved and translated ancient collections rather than erase them, and many Greek philosophical texts survive because they passed through this Arabic corridor. And a fun fact that says a lot about the social fabric: the first muezzin, Bilal ibn Rabah, had been an Ethiopian slave, and his public role broadcasting prayer signaled an ethic that ranked piety and merit above lineage. As power consolidated, tribes still mattered, but a wider identity took shape, anchored in language, law, and a sense that learning served worship and the marketplace alike. The Umayyad machine began to stall long before it broke. Governors fought rivals, tax burdens fell unevenly, and non-Arab converts, Mawali, often found themselves paying levies Arab tribes did not. Local elites in Khorasan watched distant Damascus appoint officials who rotated in and out with little concern for regional balances. Arab tribal feuds resurfaced inside the army payroll, and court politics skewed appointments. The system still collected revenue and fielded campaigns, but its claim to speak for a broad, diverse Muslim community weakened. In garrison towns from Marv to Kufa, sermons, letters, and private meetings built a mood that change was both possible and necessary. Into that opening stepped the Abbasid family, claiming descent from Al-Abbas, the Prophet's uncle. Their organizers worked in the shadows of eastern Iran, where social and ethnic coalitions could be assembled away from court surveillance. Agents moved along caravan routes, cultivating Mawali, Arab settlers, and Shia sympathizers. Slogans promised just rule and a return to rightful leadership. The movement mixed devotion, politics, and careful logistics, safe houses, coded correspondence, and envoys who could move money and messages without attracting attention. When the signal came, supporters knew where to gather and whom to follow. The shift that followed was not only a swap of rulers, it reoriented the empire's center of gravity. Damascus, with its strong Arab tribal base, had managed expansion. The Abbasids aimed for a cosmopolitan frame that could integrate Persian administrative craft, Arab legal traditions, and the ambitions of frontier soldiers. In Persia, decisive engagements broke Umayyad control. Abu al-Abbas, later known as al-Safa, consolidated victories with a clear message. The old order had exhausted its credit, and a new coalition would govern. The fallen were pursued, and the last Umayyad Caliph fled west, leaving the core lands to a fresh regime. Promises mattered. The Abbasids voiced equality across the community of believers, regardless of origin. That message resonated in Khorasan, where Persian families had long staffed bureaus and tax offices but lacked full standing. Bringing them in did more than calm resentment. It unlocked administrative capacity and literary talent. Court culture began to absorb Persian etiquette, narrative styles, and design. Army registers were revised, and tax policy sought broader compliance through clear categories and local knowledge. The chain and tone matched changes in personnel. The move eastward signaled the long-term project. New foundations on the Tigris would later become Baghdad, a site tied to river traffic and land routes that linked the steppe, India, and the Mediterranean. From there, the Abbasids could tap grain, paper, and skilled labor while coordinating the flow of scholars and artisans. The court invested in buildings that doubled as symbols and practical hubs, mosques for law and ritual, palaces with administrative halls, and treasuries to handle a wider economy. Early Abbasid patrons funded jurists, grammarians, and translators alongside architects and engineers. They commissioned chronicles to record lineage and precedent, and invited specialists to standardize coin weights, measures, and postal logistics. Libraries grew around chancery needs first, then widened to include scientific and philosophical texts. This was groundwork for the burst of scholarship that followed in the next generation. Organizers of the Abbasid Revolution ran propaganda networks and secret societies across provinces, coordinating uprisings and messaging long before modern communications existed. Al-Mansur wanted a capital that would announce a new order. Damascus carried the weight of the past. A fresh city could project control, wealth, and administrative clarity. He chose a site on the Tigris within reach of every direction. From this river bend, fleets could ride downstream toward the Gulf and upstream toward northern markets. Land routes stitched the plains to Iran, Anatolia, and Syria. The mission was practical and symbolic at once, a city that could manage taxes, armies, and ideas with equal efficiency. Construction began in 762 CE with a plan that few cities had attempted. Engineers and surveyors laid out the round city, a near-perfect circle with concentric walls and a central axis. Military logic shaped the design. 4 monumental gates funneled movement. Rings of barracks and markets absorbed traffic. Inner precincts kept the caliphal court protected yet accessible. The circle simplified defense and sent a clear message. Order radiated from the center to the edges. Brick kilns smoked day and night, roads rose from packed earth, and work crews synchronized by the river's rhythm delivered timber, stone, and grain for laborers. The Tigris anchored everything. Barges moved bulk goods faster than caravans could. Grain from the Sawad fed the population. Reeds and timber supported shipyards. The location linked the Indian Ocean trade to Mediterranean channels through overland relays and river ports. Customs officials, warehouse managers, and scribes formed a logistics spine that made the capital more than a residence for rulers. It was a switchboard for commerce, tax flows, and correspondence. Baghdad's crossroads character spread quickly. Greek-speaking clerks from Syrian towns met Persian accountants trained in Sasanian methods. Indian calculation techniques sat beside Arab legal formularies. Traders brought glassware, indigo, and steel. Scholars carried manuscripts and instruments. In markets around the outer ring, language barriers softened under common measures and agreed scales, while money changers posted rates for different mints. Techniques traveled with people: dye recipes, paper-making steps, metal casting tricks, and systems for filing documents. Early landmarks framed daily life. The Grand Palace stood at the center, connected to the Grand Mosque, where sermons set policy and law took form. The palace court housed the chancery, treasury, and post, giving officials short walks to coordinate decisions. In the bazaars, scribes sold ready-made contracts, while copyists rented desks to students. Inns clustered near gates to catch caravans at first light. Physicians set up small clinics near bathhouses. and surveyors advertised services for irrigation and building projects. Baghdad quickly matured into the intellectual heart of the realm. Abbasid patrons issued stipends for translators and mathematicians. Envoys fetched text from provincial libraries. Bilingual scholars produced Arabic versions and glosses. Court astronomers updated tables to fix prayer times and calendars. Geometry classes served architects. Arithmetic lessons trained tax collectors. The city ran on paperwork, and its scholars improved the forms behind that paperwork. At night, oil lamps lit small libraries behind shopfronts. Readers compared variant copies of a text, teachers dictated, and students took notes on paper that had become cheaper thanks to new mills. In courtyard debates, arguments about Aristotle could neighbor a practical discussion on surveying fields. Merchants weighed silks and spices as poets tested verses nearby. Here's a mind-blowing fact. Astronomers helped align the city's gates with the stars, merging technique and symbolism from day one. Under al-Ma'mun, Baghdad treated knowledge as a state project. Patronage had rules, budgets, and deliverables. Envoys brought manuscripts from provincial monasteries and courts, and the chancery recorded acquisitions. Payment schedules covered translators, revisers, and scribes. Observatories, libraries, and copying rooms fit into one workflow. The goal was clear: collect what the world knew, test it, and make it usable in Arabic for jurists, physicians, engineers, and teachers. The Beit al-Hikmah, known as the House of Wisdom, functioned as a combined library, translation bureau, and research center. Collections were cataloged by subjects so teams could locate sources fast. Translators worked from Greek and Syriac for philosophy and medicine, from Pahlavi for administration and ethics, and from Sanskrit for mathematics and astronomy. Drafts circulated to revisers who checked terminology and removed inconsistencies, while mathematicians and physicians annotated margins with corrections tied to practice. Once stabilized, the text went to copyists, who produced affordable versions for students and provincial officials. The purpose reached beyond storage. Arabic served as the working language, but the house aimed to integrate Greek theories, Persian statecraft, and Indian calculation into a single technical idiom. Astronomical tables were reformatted to match local calendrics. Medical recipes were adapted to available herbs. Geometric methods were recast with clear steps that artisans could follow. The outcome was a handbook culture, concise, reliable, and portable. The atmosphere mixed faiths and trades without ceremony. Muslim jurists shared rooms with Christian physicians, Jewish astronomers, and Zoroastrian mathematicians. Each brought prior training, monastic commentary methods, court medicine routines, and craft shop tricks for instrument making. Meetings focused on accuracy, how to render a Greek term in Arabic without losing meaning, how to test a star table against observation, how to standardize weights and measures across provinces. Hunayn bin Ishaq stood out for medical and philosophical translations. He compared multiple Greek manuscripts, compiled controlled vocabularies in Syriac and Arabic, and produced versions that physicians could apply in clinics. His students extended the program to pharmacology and anatomy. Tabit bin Qura advanced mathematics and astronomy. He reworked proofs, clarified number theory, and contributed to instrument design for observation. Their output moved fast because the institution kept editors, technicians, and patrons aligned. The The translation push marked a civilizational hinge. Manuscripts that might have vanished in scattered archives entered circulation in a durable form. Commentaries stabilized problem areas and flagged gaps for new research. When texts conflicted, Baghdad's teams did not pick one and discard the rest. They compared, tested, and issued corrected compilations that practitioners trusted. Paper, introduced from China and manufactured in local mills, changed the scale. Paper cut costs, took ink well, and enabled marginal notes and diagrams that parchment resisted. Postal routes moved quires to schools, hospitals, and courts. Account registers, star charts, and medical formularies multiplied, and with them, a shared technical vocabulary. Baghdad's libraries operated like early universities. Teachers dictated, students produced notebooks, and disputations trained memory and logic. Rooms hosted sessions on logic, physics, ethics, and metaphysics, with schedules posted and fees recorded. Teams from this milieu measured Earth's circumference within a few hundred kilometers using shadow angles and baseline surveys. Numbers became a shared tongue across courts, caravans, and workshops. In the early 9th century, scholars began treating arithmetic and geometry as tools that could serve both the sky and the shop. Calendar makers, tax clerks, architects, and astronomers used common procedures, and the House of Wisdom turned those procedures into teachable steps. Tables, proofs, and worked examples replaced vague rules, so a student in Basra could solve the same problem as a surveyor in Kufa. At the center stood Muhammad bin Musa al-Khwarizmi, a mathematician whose texts offered a clean way to handle quantity. He wrote handbooks that stated problems, laid out operations, and gave numerical examples with clear endings. His book on completion and balancing, Algebra wal Muqabala, defined operations for unknowns and brought order to linear and quadratic cases. He solved for shares in inheritance, settled partnerships in trade, and set ratios for land division where boundaries curved along canals and irregular plots. Builders used his layouts to compute areas for courtyards and domes, keeping costs and materials aligned. His name later gave us the word algorithm because his approach focused on step-by-step rules that always terminate. Start here, apply this, and arrive at a result. That mindset moved across disciplines. Astronomers used sequences to reduce observations. Accountants tallied revenues with positional notation. Jurists checked legal shares with standardized operations. The method mattered as much as the solution because it could be taught, repeated, and audited. A major shift came with Hindu-Arabic numerals. The symbols 0 through 9, written on paper, let a single column carry place value for tens, hundreds, and beyond. Compared to older systems that relied on repeated marks or special symbols, the new notation made multiplication and division practical on the page. Schools taught algorithms for carrying and borrowing. Market stalls kept neater ledgers. State treasuries reconciled regional accounts faster and with fewer copying errors. 0, Sifra, sat at the heart of this system. It held a place when nothing was there and let digits move rank without confusion. That absence with function felt strange to readers trained on counters and letters, but it still proved powerful. Astronomers fixed their sexagesimal fractions more cleanly. Geometers aligned steps in proportional reasoning. Even with resistance elsewhere, the practice spread because it saved time and exposed mistakes quickly. Geometry left the page and entered stone and wood. Mosque plans relied on circles, squares, and star polygons laid with compass and cord. Craftsmen used proportional grids to scale arches and domes while keeping thrusts balanced. Pattern makers developed repeat units that tiled walls and floors without gaps, using rules tied to symmetry and angle. The mathematics guided cuts, not just decoration, and made complex forms buildable at large scale. Trigonometry advanced as observers refined the links between angles and lengths. Sine tables improved, and procedures for tangent and cotangent entered handbooks. Scholars such as al-Battani adjusted values for the solar year and eclipse timing, which in turn improved prayer schedules and navigation across open deserts and seas. Mariners learned to treat latitude and direction with numerical aids, while instrument makers etched scales that matched computed functions. Medicine in this era shifted from a list of remedies to a science with rules, records, and tests. Physicians wrote case notes, compared outcomes, and corrected recipes when results failed. Ethics guided practice, consent before procedures, accountability for mistakes, and triage that prioritized the most urgent cases. Doctors learned to link systems with natural causes rather than rely on charms. Anatomy lessons from animal dissections informed surgery. Pharmacology drew on measured doses and standardized preparations. The goal was repeatability, methods any trained practitioner could apply in the same way and judge by the patient's recovery. Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo built institutions that made this system run. Bimaristans operated day and night, staffed by rotating teams. Intake clerks registered patients and directed them to specialized wards, fevers in one area, eye diseases in another, fractures in a surgical unit. Pharmacies compounded medicines from written formularies and issued labeled doses. Teaching rooms adjoined the wards so students could observe rounds, hear diagnoses, and copy prescriptions under supervision. Discharge protocols included follow-up visits and food stipends for the poor, turning hospitals into public services rather than pay-to-enter clinics. Al-Razi, a practicing clinician and prolific writer, documented cases across decades and compared therapies for the same condition to see which worked best. In Kitab al-Hawi, he compiled observations, debates, and practical notes that physicians could consult at the bedside. He separated smallpox from measles by clinical signs, timing of fever, distribution of rash, and course of illness, so treatment could be targeted instead of generic. He advised against untested compounds and tracked side effects with unusual candor for the period. His hospital leadership in Baghdad also left administrative models, ward organization, staff duties, and record keeping that other cities adopted. Ali bin al-Abbas al-Majusi wrote the Complete Book of the Medical Art, a structured manual that began with anatomy and physiology and moved through diagnosis, pharmacology, and surgery. The work trained generations with clear chapters, defined terms, and stepwise procedures. It traveled widely in later centuries because its method translated across languages and systems. Where earlier compilations mixed theory and anecdote, this handbook separated them, allowing practitioners to update sections as evidence improved. Cleanliness and mental well-being stood alongside drugs and scalpels. Hospitals mandated regular bathing, linen changes, and airflow to limit contagion and odor. Quiet courtyards with fountains calmed patients. Attendants read calming prose to the restless. Physicians recorded sleep, diet, and mood, and they adjusted treatment when the stress slowed healing. Some wards used music to reduce anxiety, noting better appetite and steadier pulse in patients who rested after sessions. These details made care humane and effective. The medical corpus blended Greek physiology, Persian clinical routines, and Indian materia medica. Scholars tested inherited theories against bedside results and adjusted dosages to locally available herbs and minerals. Pharmacies smelled of musk, camphor, and myrrh. Mortars crushed leaves and resins into syrups, pills, and ointments. Scales measured to tight tolerances. In anatomy rooms, scholars examined animal organs to refine surgical cautions on vessels and nerves. Ward design kept corridors wide for stretchers and let water from central fountains flow for cleaning and calm. The intellectual crossroads formed when scholars faced a practical question: how to align revealed law and ritual with the methods of reasoning arriving through newly translated books. Courts needed reliable argument standards for judges and physicians. Astronomers needed rules to test models. The result was a shared project. Use reason to clarify what faith teaches and to organize knowledge into disciplines that could be taught, checked, and improved. Al-Kindi took the first large step in this direction. Called the philosopher of the Arabs, he treated Greek philosophy as a set of tools rather than a rival doctrine. He wrote on causes, definitions, and the nature of the intellect, always asking how these ideas could sharpen Arabic expression and legal discussion. He advised on precise terminology so that when a judge or a physician made a claim, the terms carried a stable meaning. He guided translators to preserve structure in arguments, not just vocabulary, which made imported logic usable in courtrooms and clinics. As the translations of Aristotle, Plato, and Plotinus spread, they posed new problems. If nature follows knowable patterns, where does miracle fit? If ethics can rest on reason, how does revelation instruct conscience? These weren't abstract puzzles. They pressed on medical prognosis, on astronomy's predictive aims, and on law's burden of proof. Metaphysics set the frame. Substance and accident, potential and actual, necessity and contingency. Logic trains students to avoid equivocation and to separate demonstration from persuasion. Ethics asked what counted as the highest human good when both the mind and the soul demanded cultivation. Al-Farabi extended the program and earned the title second teacher after Aristotle. He mapped the sciences into an ordered curriculum, language as preparation, logic as instrument, mathematics as measure, physics for motion and change, and metaphysics for first principles. He analyzed political forms and described the virtuous city as a place where knowledge guides leadership and education forms character. He also wrote about music theory with the same structure, definitions, classifications, and the effects of modes, keeping method consistent across arts and sciences. His system told students where each field began, what counted as proof inside it, and how disciplines supported one another without confusion. These debates unfolded in Baghdad's study circles, chancery offices, and hospital classrooms. Philosophers sat with mutakallimum, the theologians trained in dialectic. Sessions had rules: define terms, state premises, show the chain of inference, and accept correction if the form fails. The exchange was spirited but procedural. A physician might defend a casual claim with observation and analogy, while a theologian pressed the limits of necessity and divine will. The shared craft was logic, and it moved into curricula for medicine, theology, astronomy, and even grammar. Tension never disappeared. Some warned that speculative metaphysics could overreach and cloud scriptural clarity. Others argued that neglecting demonstration left science vulnerable to authority and habit. This friction set the conditions for later critiques and syntheses, but it also trained readers to separate fields by method. Under oil lamps, students traced syllogisms on scrap paper, compared variant passages of Aristotle, and cross-referenced Quranic exegesis with ethical maxims from Persian literature. Night after night, the sky served two needs at once. It framed devotion by setting prayer times and lunar months, and it invited measurement with tools that could test claims about the heavens. Scholars treated observation as worship through method. Align an instrument, take a reading, compare it with a table, and revise the numbers if the star drifted from prediction. That habit turned mosques, courts, and workshops into places where the same calculations supported both ritual and research. Cities invested in observatories that could host that kind of work. In Baghdad and Damascus, platforms carried sighting walls, graduated quadrants, and carefully leveled water clocks. Assistants checked plumb lines and marked meridian lines on floors so measurements could be repeated the next night. Later centers in the east, like Samarkand, scaled up the instruments, massive quadrants fixed into masonry and calibrated against the sun's noon height. Astrolabes proliferated in these settings because they compressed a sky model into brass, latitude plates, reedy for stars, and rule for quick solutions. Al-Battani's tables became a common reference. He refined the length of the solar year and tracked the equation of time with values that corrected older lists. His procedures taught readers how to reduce raw observation into parameters that could drive calendars and eclipse predictions. Mariners and timekeepers benefited because small errors in the sun's motion compounded quickly, and his numbers kept drift under control. Cataloging the sky became a craft of its own. Al-Sufi compiled a star atlas that updated magnitudes, names, and positions, and described a faint cloud in Andromeda, an entry later recognized as the first known record of that galaxy. He reconciled Arabic star lore with Greek constellations, so readers could move between traditions without losing precision. Copyists added diagrams that kept the orientation consistent across manuscripts, and instrument makers etched the same lists onto their plates. Refining the Ptolemaic model occupied many sessions. Astronomers compared predicted positions with nightly readings, then adjusted parameters, proposed alternative circles, or introduced new devices to handle irregular motion. They issued revised handbooks with clear instructions for computing planetary longitudes and latitudes. Over time, these corrections produced clearer ephemerides and a culture that prioritized testable steps over deference to old tables. The practical edge stayed sharp. Determining the Qibla for any town required geometry on a sphere, so mathematicians wrote procedures that used known latitudes and longitudes to compute direction. Muwaqqits in mosques used astrolabes and sundials to post daily prayer times. Navigators at sea used star heights to estimate latitude and kept course with bearings learned from coastal pilots, aided by portable quadrants and simple Kamal boards. Geography advanced in parallel. Travelers and officials collected distances, river courses, and market lists. Geographers organized them into regional surveys. Ali Disri, working for the Sicilian court, compiled one of the era's most detailed world maps, combining merchant routes, coastal soundings, and older coordinates into a coherent planisphere with extensive text. His descriptions tied goods, climates, and peoples to mapped space, making the atlas useful for planning and trade. Workrooms show the craft. Scholars traced arcs on parchment with compasses, checked angles against brass scales, and logged results in neat columns. Large instruments in courtyards fixed star angles against stone. On the Indian Ocean, sailors lifted astrolabes to read a star's altitude above a rolling horizon and then set their heading with confidence. At the height of the Golden Age, art and architecture served as the shared language of identity. Courts, mosques, and marketplaces treated verse and prose as public goods, not private hobbies. A line of poetry could settle a dispute, elevate a patron, or set a moral lesson in motion. The written word carried status, and the spoken word carried reach. As schools and libraries multiplied, the arts met scholarship in a practical alliance. Literacy built memory, and art gave memory something worth carrying. Arabic took the lead as the language of intellect. Grammar schools produced readers who could parse fine distinctions in law and theology, and that precision fed prose style. Secretaries in the chancery wrote letters that balanced clarity with cadence, and scholars shaped treatises that moved with rhythm. In parallel, Persian grew into the language of romance and courtly reflection. Its meters and imagery suited stories about love, fate, and kingship, and its diction favored nuance and feeling. Together, these tongues occupied different lanes yet shared the same road, one steering technical thought, the other shaping emotional and narrative depth. Within that landscape, two figures stood out. Al-Mutanabi forged verses that combined confidence, wit, and sharp observation. His poems traveled quickly because performers could carry them from hall to hall, and listeners remembered them after a single hearing. Rudaki, often called the father of Persian poetry, set templates for court performance and personal reflection. His work helped establish euphony and flow that later poets elaborated. Both men benefited from audiences trained to judge meter, meaning, and moral weight without needing a written script in hand. Visual art followed rules that turned restraint into a system. Calligraphy transformed scripture and scholarship into forms where beauty served legibility. Scribes practiced hands that balanced speed with harmony, and workshops matched inks and papers to preserve lines across generations. Geometric design took shape in tiles, woodwork, and textiles. Craftsmen used compasses and straight edges to build repeat units and interlacing bands that never required figurative images. The result filled walls and pages with patterns that signaled order and measure. Prose culture expanded through adab, a blend of ethics, history, and practical wisdom. Collections like Kalila wa Dimna offered layered fables where animals debated policy and prudence for human readers. Courtiers learned how to speak, advise, and joke without offense. Students learned how to weigh choices. The same mix appeared in manuals for secretaries, travel accounts, and moral essays. Variety mattered. Short anecdotes taught timing. Longer stories trained patience and inference. Storytelling bridged eras. Pre-Islamic odes, once performed at fairs, continued to guide memory techniques and standards of eloquence. New compilations gathered legends, travel tales, courtroom dramas into cycles that later fed the stream we know through the 1001 Nights. Narrators kept an ear for suspense and a hand for structure. Scenes linked cleanly, and digressions returned to their purpose, so listeners stayed oriented. Patronage kept the arts employed. Caliphs and governors funded poets, musicians, and artisans who marked ceremonies and recorded triumphs. Payment could be immediate, a purse after a recital, or long-term in stipends and commissions. Public readings took place in reception halls where the interplay of word and rhythm mattered. Drums set a pulse, a reader began, and a chorus recited refrains until the lines settled in the crowd. The thread in the east had frayed, but in the far west, a survivor rewrote it. Abd al-Rahman I, the Umayyad prince who had escaped the Abbasids, crossed North Africa and reached Iberia, where Arab and Berber factions competed for control. He built a new base in Cordoba, securing loyalty with land grants, marriages, and a guard drawn from Berber allies and local converts. He stabilized tax collection, reformed the army, and declared an emirate that answered to no Eastern court. From that decision, a Western Golden Age took shape with its own pace and priorities. Cordoba grew into a city that announced its status through infrastructure. Roads were paved, bridges kept trade steady in winter, and waterworks fed public baths and gardens. Street lamps burned at night in long rows, and patrols kept order so shops could open early and close late. Book markets multiplied near mosques and palaces, and paper from local mills kept prices within reach for students and clerks. Physicians, jurists, and artisans formed guild-like circles that trained apprentices and kept standards. The social fabric ran on fusion rather than uniformity. Arab administrators worked with Berber commanders who knew the terrain and the frontier tribes. Jewish physicians and scholars held court appointments, while Christian scribes managed bilingual records in Latin and Arabic. Contracts reflected this mix, allowing parties to choose judges from different communities while keeping outcomes respected across neighborhoods. Music blended Eastern modes with local rhythms, and cuisine combined North African spices with Iberian produce. Cordoba's Great Mosque embodied that synthesis. Its forest of columns and double-tiered arches served both structure and style, lifting the roof without heavy walls and letting light move across the hall. Additions under later rulers extended the plan with measured precision, keeping rhythm and proportions consistent even as the footprint expanded. The complex hosted prayer, law lectures, and readings, so theology, poetry, and policy often shared the same air. Under Abd al-Rahman III, Cordoba took the title of Caliphate, projecting independence and confidence. He built reception halls and reception cities, managed diplomacy across the Mediterranean, and funded scholars who wrote in Arabic and Hebrew. His successor, Al-Hakam II, deepened the city's book culture. He organized cataloging projects, sent buyers to the East for rare titles, and paid copyists who could reproduce complex scientific diagrams accurately. Libraries grew, with sections for medicine, mathematics, philosophy, and adab, and teachers rotated through rooms on fixed schedules. Names for this period bridged worlds. Averroes, or Bin Rushd, wrote commentaries that clarified Aristotle's arguments step by step, providing technical language that later Latin translators could render into scholastic vocabulary. He also practiced medicine and served as a judge, moving between theory and application with one toolkit. Maimonides, trained in his Andalusi environment, wrote medical treatises and legal codes that traveled with diaspora communities, carrying methods forged in Cordoba's circles. The transmission channel widened in Toledo and Cordoba, where translators working in teams rendered Arabic science and philosophy into Latin and the local Romance tongues. Workshops set up a workflow. A native Arabic reader explained the text, a writer produced a draft in Latin, and a reviser checked the terms against established glossaries. These copies moved to Paris and Bologna, where they seeded curricula. Courtyards under orange trees hosted debates in the evening, while fountains cooled marble halls. Melodies rose in garden pavilions as students recited lines and teachers corrected meter. Bin al-Haytham stepped into this story from Basra with a clear aim: test claims about light with procedures anyone could repeat. He trained first in mathematics and astronomy, then turned to vision because older explanations did not match observation. Greek authorities argued the eye sent out rays to touch objects. He asked a simpler question that could be checked: does vision start at the eye or at the source of light? His answer reversed the premise. He argued that light travels from luminous bodies and from illuminated surfaces into the eye. That shift placed the burden on external rays and on the eye's capacity to receive, not emit. To support it, he analyzed how bright sources overwhelm vision and why sunlight blinds more than darkness does. He examined shadows and penumbras, showing how their borders behave when objects block a straight path of light. Each case lined up with incoming rays, not outgoing sight beams. The Book of Optics organized the proof. Across its volumes, he set definitions, stated postulates, and built propositions with geometric reasoning. He treated reflection from mirrors and refraction through transparent media as measurable events, not just curiosities. Angles in, angles out. Change the medium, change the path. He described how visual perception depends on the geometry of rays entering the pupil and on the brain combining signals into a coherent image. He separated physical light from psychological interpretation, giving later scholars a path to study both without confusion. Mathematics anchored this method. He modeled light rays as straight lines and used geometry to predict where an image should appear on a screen or within a mirror. Physics supplied causes. Different materials slow or redirect light. He then tested predictions with controlled setups. He repeated trials, varied a single parameter, and checked consistency. The loop ran in one order: observe, hypothesize, deduce, test, revise, until claims held under new conditions. The camera obscura became his cleanest demonstration. He darkened a room, cut a small aperture, and let a narrow beam project the outside scene onto a wall. He noted the image appeared inverted and sharpened as the opening shrank. That behavior followed straight-line travel and explained how complex scenes can be rendered without the eye sending anything out. Later instrument makers kept this design, and centuries down the line, it fed directly into camera construction. His reach crossed languages and borders. Latin readers knew him as Alhazen. Scholars in Europe studied his discussions of refraction, image formation, and visual errors. Roger Bacon expanded experimental optics with his structure in mind. Kepler used similar lines of reasoning to place the image on the retina. Newton explored light's behavior armed with a tradition that already treated experimentation and mathematics as joint tools. The scenes of his work carry a calm rhythm: a shuttered window, a pinhole cut with care, a bright patch forming on plaster. A mirror turned a few degrees, a new angle measured, a result logged. He wrote under pressure, too. In Cairo, he feigned madness to avoid a dangerous assignment, then continued studying while confined, producing manuscripts that moved beyond commentary into tested claims. Ibn Sina, known in Latin as Avicenna, grew up in the Persian lands of Bukhara and Khwarazm, where access to private libraries and itinerant teachers turned a precocious mind into a systematic thinker. Before 18, He could read through medicine, logic, and astronomy, not as scattered topics, but as a connected toolkit. He treated nobles while still studying, gaining access to collections that broadened his curriculum beyond any single master. The habit that formed early stayed with him: absorb, test, refine, and write. His medical achievement bears a title that echoed for centuries: the Canon of Medicine. It organized illnesses, symptoms, and treatments with a clarity that physicians could use at the bedside, and it standardized pharmacology with careful notes on dosage and compound interactions. Its influence stretched across hospitals and universities from Cairo to Paris, not because it dazzled with prose, but because its structure made medicine teachable and repeatable. Pharmacists copied its formularies. Lecturers taught from its outlines. Commentators argued with it line by line, which kept its framework alive even when the details evolved. Avicenna did not confine himself to medicine. He set out to map reality with the same order he brought to physiology. Drawing from Aristotle and late antique commentators, he framed a system that connected logic, physics, psychology, and metaphysics. At its center stood a distinction that changed the way scholars approached being itself. What a thing is, its essence, does not explain that it is, its existence. That gap required an explanation, and Avicenna argued for a necessary existent that grants existence to contingent things. This move shaped debates across cultures, entering the work of later Muslim theologians and, through translations, the great schools of medieval Christian thought. He treated the soul with similar care, not as a poetic metaphor, but as the subject of analysis. In his psychology, perception, imagination, and intellect formed a graded path from sensation to understanding. He argued that human reason, when disciplined by logic and purified of error, could rise toward truths that point beyond the material. Rather than set reason against devotion, he treated rational inquiry as a route that aligns with spiritual ascent, giving scholars a method to approach questions that theologians and mystics also examined. The breadth of his writing is hard to grasp in a single shelf. He produced hundreds of works across medicine, logic, metaphysics, ethics, astronomy, and music theory. Some were massive syntheses. Others were concise handbooks that circulated through study circles, courts. In them, we find a consistent pattern: define terms, state principles, test consequences, and correct confusion. The style reads like an engineer drawing a blueprint for the intellect. His medical encyclopedia did more than classify diseases. It discussed contagion, recommended isolating the sick during outbreaks, and insisted on trialing new remedies with controlled observation before general use. In an era without microscopes, he treated evidence as the arbiter and warned against authority that lacked demonstration. That habit of disciplined skepticism explains why students copied his texts for generations. One scene captures him well: a scholar at a low table, scrolls open, ink drying on a neat page, an astrolabe nearby, celestial diagrams sketched in the margins. The tools change when he shifts from medicine to metaphysics, but the posture does not. He learned by repetition so intense that rereading a single work dozens of times stayed part of his routine. That stamina fed his range, and his range fed an empire of readers who built their own systems on the scaffolding he left behind. Power drifted away from Baghdad in slow steps. Provincial governors kept tax revenues to pay their own troops, and commanders drawn from Turkish and Dalamite ranks answered first to their stipends, not to distant orders. As supply lines stretched from Khorasan to the Maghreb, local strongmen learned that recognition from the Caliph mattered less than the control of fortresses, markets, and canals. Coins still bore Abbasid names, but the hands that minted them now belonged to regional courts. Independent dynasties emerged with their own claims to authority. In North Africa, the Fatimids promoted an alternative lineage and built a state that pushed eastward. In the Iranian plateau and Iraq, the Buyids, Dalamite military leaders, entered Baghdad, guiding policy while keeping the Caliph on the throne as a sign of continuity. To the far west, the Umayyads in Cordoba raised their status, asserting sovereignty over a flourishing Iberian realm. Each court established its chancery, its judges, and its network of clients, projecting power through law as much as through the sword. Fragmentation did not stifle learning. It multiplied its addresses. Cairo added theology, law, and astronomy to its curriculum as its endowments grew. Bukhara and Nishapur sponsored scholars who wrote in Arabic and Persian, while court libraries circulated compendia that moved with embassies and merchants. Cordoba supported physicians, philosophers, and grammarians whose work crossed languages through translators and copyists. Instead of a single hub, the map lit up with many beacons. Inside Baghdad, authority narrowed. Viziers managed revenue and appointments, and military commanders negotiated garrison placements and salaries. The Caliph's court still received delegations, confirmed treaties, and issued robes of honor, yet much of the daily machinery ran through bureaucrats and officers who balanced rival factions. Patronage continued, but the initiative often came from ministers who sought prestige by supporting scholars and engineers. The Fatimids reshaped Egypt with a new capital, Al-Qahira, and endowed a center of learning that outlasted dynasties. Al-Azhar became a place where lectures, legal opinions, and debates accumulated across generations, its Waqf endowments binding scholarship to stable funding. This model, property whose revenues permanently financed teaching, protected study circles from court upheavals, allowing curricula to expand and specialize. Rival courts invested in culture as a form of diplomacy. Poets composed odes that fixed victories in memory. Astronomers compiled tables for calendars and navigation. Physicians staffed hospitals whose methods impressed visiting officials. A treatise dedicated to a ruler served as both practical handbook and political statement. The arts and sciences became measures of legitimacy when borders shifted and alliances changed. Trade routes mirrored these rivalries. Caravans steered toward friendly ports and safe passes, redirecting taxes and tolls. Alliances formed and dissolved along sectarian lines and local interests, setting Sunni and Shia patrons on diverging paths, even as scholars read the same books. Coastal commerce in the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean linked courts to Sicily, East Africa, and Gujarat, blending materials, instruments, and techniques that then entered workshops and observatories. The period combined instability with invention. Multiple calendars, law schools, and philosophical programs developed in parallel, sometimes contesting, often cross-pollinating. Copyists carried manuscripts between cities. Physicians compared hospital protocols. Mathematicians exchanged problems by letter. At one moment in the 10th century, 3 rival caliphs ruled: Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo, each claiming universal leadership. Yet a merchant could ferry a new commentary from one realm to another and find a buyer in the same week. Even in competition, traffic of ideas outran the pace of armies. A scholar in Nishapur might cite a work copied in Toledo that had traveled by way of Ifriqiya and Fustat. They arrived from the steppe, speaking a Turkic tongue and carrying the habits of mounted warfare. The Seljuk Turks accepted Islam through contact with scholars and traders along the Oxus, and they moved west as small clans that learned to act as a single force. Their leaders framed themselves as protectors of Sunni practice at a time when rival courts competed for religious authority. What began as service as frontier fighters turned into rule. Their cavalry could cover long distances quickly, pressuring cities into negotiation before a siege even began. Under Tughril Beg, they seized routes and towns along Khorasan and Persia, then advanced towards Iraq. He entered Baghdad not as a usurper, but as the ally who could secure the capital and its markets. His successor, Alp Arslan, pushed farther, consolidating Persia and striking into eastern Anatolia. Garrisons anchored their gains, but so did terms offered to local elites. Keep your lands, deliver taxes, provide troops. With each campaign, they replaced fragmented authority with a chain of command that reached from caravan posts to the caliph's court. They raised the Abbasid caliph's status while retaining the levers of power. The caliph granted titles, blessed campaigns, and served as the religious head. Seljuk sultans commanded armies, appointed governors, and managed revenue. This balance gave their rule a broad legitimacy. Friday sermons named the caliph, but sultanic decrees set policy. It was a practical division. The moral center remained in Baghdad, and the administrative weight shifted to Seljuk chancelleries. Administration fused Persian methods with Turkic discipline. Persian scribes kept registers, drafted edicts, and managed land tax assessments. Military iqta grants supported cavalry without draining the central treasury, turning tax rights into a budget for soldiers and horses. Couriers moved sealed orders between provincial capitals, and audits checked governors who treated public revenue as private wealth. The result was a system that could pay armies on time, keep roads policed, and stabilize prices in major markets. In 1071, at Manzikert, Alp Arslan's forces broke a Byzantine army and captured its emperor on the field. The victory opened highland routes and valleys in Anatolia to Turkish settlement, planting new towns and frontier emirates that changed the region's demography and economy. From there, trade and migration pushed west, and local polities formed under Seljuk suzerainty. Nizam al-Mulk, their famed vizier, gave the state an intellectual backbone. He founded Nizamiya colleges in cities from Nishapur to Baghdad, endowing salaries for professors of law, theology, and grammar, and providing student stipends and dormitories. Teaching schedules, standardized curricula, and appointment procedures produced reliable training for judges, administrators, and preachers. His Book of Government circulated as a practical manual for rulers and officials, making it one of the earliest political handbooks in any language. Seljuk patronage reshaped city skylines and travel networks. Mosques rose with brick domes and carved stucco. Caravanserais dotted routes at day-ride intervals, giving merchants secure lodging, stables, and storage. Schools and libraries attached to mosques turned courtyards into classrooms, where scholars taught under colonnades in morning light. Mounted archers still defined their military profile, but stone and syllabus displayed their long-term ambitions. They contested Fatimid influence in Syria and the Hijaz and spent resources holding fractious frontiers. After strong rulers died, rival princes and military households split provinces, and assassinations by militant sects added strain. Yet the word sultan took hold, signaling authority rooted in command and administration rather than lineage alone, and that vocabulary outlived their dynasty. He rises at a moment when libraries are full and arguments are louder than drums. Abu Hamid al-Ghazali comes of age in a landscape where jurists draft rulings, philosophers model the cosmos, and mystics speak of the heart's veils. Courts sponsor debates in law colleges and private salons. Students memorize grammar by day and test syllogisms by night. In this climate, questions sharpen. What counts as certain knowledge? Where do reason and revelation meet? And who decides the limits of each? Al-Ghazali trains as a jurist in the Shafi'i school and studies logic, kalam theology, and philosophy with rigor that impresses patrons and rivals. He receives the post most scholars only hear about, a chair at the Nizamiya College of Baghdad while still young. The schedule is punishing: lectures, disputations, and responses to challenges from every camp. He writes handbooks for students, legal opinions for officials, and polemics for peers. The public sees a brilliant mind in command. In private, a crack widens. That inner break becomes decisive. He loses his voice while teaching, a silence that speaks of doubt more than illness. Reputation, income, and influence fall away as he leaves Baghdad. He turns to Sufism, not as withdrawal from thought, but as a method to test the self. He seeks austere teachers, practices remembrance, and watches how desire dresses itself as reason. Damascus, Jerusalem, and Mecca mark the path. Solitude and travel pair with notes that later become books. From that journey comes a vast synthesis. Ihya Ulum al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences. It does not treat law as a list or ethics as slogans. It examines intention, distraction, pride, envy, charity, earning, marriage, friendship, and death. It links outer practice to inner states and studies how habits reshape the heart. The pages move between evidence, analysis, and advice, and they read like a clinic for the soul. Jurists quote it for method, preachers for lessons, and ordinary readers for guidance that meets daily life. He also writes The Incoherence of the Philosophers, a targeted critique of claims he judges overconfident. He accepts logic and demonstration where they apply and rejects metaphysical claims he sees as speculative leaps. He argues that unaided reason cannot settle questions about creation, God's knowledge, or bodily resurrection. He calls for disciplines to know their limits, and he insists that revelation sets boundaries where proof runs out. In doing so, he resets the terms of debate without shutting the door on analysis. His work restores balance. Philosophy's tools stay in the toolkit, but they serve faith rather than replace it. Mysticism regains intellectual respect through method and accountability. Law learns to ask about motives, not only outcomes. This posture travels far. In the Latin West, scholastics sift his arguments and adapt them for their own frameworks, carrying forward his insistence that reason and doctrine must answer to each other. Scenes from these years show a steady rhythm. He prays alone before dawn, copies lines by candlelight, and returns to teach in similar settings with fewer displays. He refines a language for moral psychology, tracing how thoughts become impulses, and impulses become acts. That analysis makes him a pioneer who studies the struggle between reason, appetite, and faith with clinical care. The reach of his revival grows through public reading circles, private copies, and students who carry the program back to law schools and town mosques. Ideas gained weight, and took on moving parts. Theories from philosophers and mathematicians turned into valves, gears, and measured flows that shaped streets, farms, and workshops. In the 12th century, engineers treated knowledge like a toolkit. Cities drew water with calibrated devices, mills powered workshops, and craft guilds built precise instruments for surveying, timekeeping, and irrigation. The shift showed up in contracts and city records, work crews scheduled by the hour, canals maintained by rotating teams, and workshops that kept parts lists for repairs. The Golden Age met daily life through machines that set rhythms for markets, prayer, and transport. Al-Jazari stands out as the clearest voice of this turn toward applied craft. Serving in the Artukid court, he wrote a manual that reads like a catalog, a lab notebook, and a teaching text. The Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices describes over 100 machines, each diagram paired with a method, materials list, and assembly steps. He favored modular construction, wooden frames, bronze shafts, leather seals, and weights to cut tolerances that repeat across different builds. The result is a system where one workshop could replicate another's device without guesswork. Timekeeping pushed him toward complex clocks that did more than mark hours. He used float regulators, siphons, and clepsydra basins to keep steady flow, then translated that motion through cams and gears. Water raised by shadoufs and scoop wheels moved to cisterns that fed public fountains, garden rills, and ablution courts. In river towns, geared mills turned grindstones while upstream sluices kept constant head pressure. Hydraulic knowledge matured from rule of thumb to measured design, with scale drawings and repair instructions to keep the system stable through seasons. His automata earned attention because they brought mechanics into public view. Water-powered peacocks that dispensed ablution water, boat parties watched musicians strike rhythms triggered by rotating drums, and a cupbearer figure advanced by hidden linkages. One design used pegs on a cylinder to set sequences, making a programmable routine that could be changed by moving the pegs. This logic migrated to other devices, where cams controlled valves and levers in timed order, turning flow into choreography. Architecture incorporated mechanical thinking. Muqarnas domes required precise templates and load paths that builders worked out with full-scale plaster models. Doors rotated on bronze pivots with recessed sockets that reduced friction and wear. Workshop treatises show gear teeth cut to proportional rules so that torque moved cleanly between shafts, a practice that later appeared in European manuscripts with similar ratios. Construction sites looked like coordinated labs, masons, carpenters, metalworkers, and surveyors using plumb bobs, sighting rods, and calibrated ropes. Inventors also tested power sources beyond water. Windmills with vertical or horizontal sails drove grainstones in dry regions, their orientation aligned with prevailing winds recorded by local windroses. Notes on flight attempted controlled glides using wing frames and fabric, focusing on balance and lift rather than leap and hope jumps. Boiler experiments used sealed vessels and steam to move lids and pistons for brief strokes, showing curiosity about heat and pressure cycles, even if fuel economics kept them as demonstration. Workshops stayed busy well into the night. Oil lamps lit benches where artisans filed bronze gears, bent pipe, and stitched leather gaskets while scribes copied diagrams onto fresh folios. Al-Jazari's mechanisms introduced the crankshaft, converting reciprocal motion to rotation with a reliability that now sits inside modern engines. One of his water clocks changed its display every hour with zodiac panels, falcons, and drummers shifting on cue, turning time into a moving lesson that taught mechanics as much as it entertained audiences. Trade knits this world together like a nervous system. Caravans move along the Maghreb and Mashriq routes, linking oases and river valleys with steady stages marked by wells and caravanserais. Camel trains carried textile, paper, and salt across the Sahara to Africa and back to the Sahel. To the east, the Silk Road's branches feed into Khorasan and Transoxiana, then south toward Basra and the Gulf. Maritime lanes extend the network further. Does ride monsoon winds from Aden to Calicut and from Siraf to the Strait of Malacca, arriving in seasons set by wind charts refined over generations. Ports on the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf funnel cargoes inland through Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus, where wholesalers break shipments into lots for regional markets. Goods travel in both bulk and brilliance. From India and Southeast Asia come pepper, cardamom, cloves, and indigo. From China arrive silk bolts, porcelain, and lacquerware. West Africa supplies gold dust, kola, and ivory, moving through Sijil Massa and Tahert to coastal exchanges. Syrian workshops send glassware and fine metalwork. Aleppo clothiers export dyed textiles. Egyptian papermakers supply sheets that make copying cheaper and faster than parchment. Manuscripts travel in crates with price notes on the flyleaf, joining libraries in mosques, madrasas, and private homes. As goods shift hands, customs houses record weights and measures, using standardized scales that keep disputes low and turnover high. Merchants learn a shared language. Arabic becomes the ledger tongue of account books, contracts, and maritime manuals, boosted by chancery forms that repeat across cities. Islamic coins, gold dinars and silver dirhams, circulate with consistent weight and fineness, so a deal struck in Cordoba can be settled in Cairo or Nishapur without reweighing every piece. Money changers post exchange rates between local coppers and regional silver, and assayers stamp bars for large payments. Trust rides on recognizable script and reliable mint marks. Institutions keep risk manageable. Merchant guilds negotiate tolls and guard clauses with governors. Partners spread cargo across several ships and caravans rather than bet on one haul. Credit letters, SOC, let a trader deposit funds in Baghdad and draw them in Sind or Guangzhou, with brokers confirming identity by seals and coded phrases. Couriers move with endorsements along the same routes that carry news and scientific texts. With paper, a fortune can move safer than a chest of coins. Seafaring skill closes the distance between continents. Navigators read the monsoon cycle by month and latitude, use improved astrolabes to fix altitude of known stars, and consult compasses for bearings when coasts vanish in haze. Portolan-style notes list reefs, anchorages, and water sources. Hulls use sewn plank or nailed construction according to region, and lateen rigs give agility for tacking along tricky shores. Crews mix languages, Arabic on the quarterback, Persian in the hold, Swahili at the gangway, because cargoes and crews are as mixed as the ports they serve. Hubs turn trade into culture. Cordoba's markets carry North African leather, Andalusian steel, and imported aromatics. Scholars there borrow instruments and texts that arrived with traders. Cairo links Mediterranean and Indian Ocean circuits, its cons dense with brokers and packers. Samarkand sits where steppe routes meet irrigated valleys, so embassies and caravans share inns and news. Under arcades, sellers fold shimmering silks beside baskets of cinnamon and myrrh, while scribes draft contracts and settle claims over tea. A merchant can pay with a check drawn months earlier, and a sailor can tell how far home is by the stars. At the start of the 13th century, a new power forms on the Eurasian steppe under a leader named Genghis Khan. He reorganizes clans into disciplined units, promotes officers by merit, and builds a courier network that can relay orders across mountains and deserts. The result is a machine for war that moves faster than its enemies can plan. Towns that refuse to submit face coordinated assaults with archers, sappers, and siege crews drilled to work as one. Victories compound because news of them outruns the riders. The Islamic world stands squarely in the path. Khwarezm's trading cities lie on the arteries that link China, Transoxiana, and Iran. When a dispute turns deadly, the conflict escalates into annihilation. Otrar, Bukhara, and Samarkand fall in sequence, each with its libraries, scholars, and endowments. Manuscript rooms empty in the smoke of burning quarters. In Persia and Central Asia, workshops that made instruments, paper, and glazed tile go silent. Caravans reroute or stop entirely, breaking the chain that once moved goods, money, and ideas from one center to another. Resistance forms, but not as a single shield. Rival dynasts argue over precedence, city militias distrust frontier commanders, and sectarian rivalries sap coordination. Some garrisons fight to the last, others negotiate and open their gates, hoping to preserve lives by avoiding a storm. The Mongols press this advantage. They map rivers, test walls with mining teams, and apply techniques they gather from conquered engineers. The psychological strike lands first. Stories of destroyed cities cross the plains ahead of the scouts and bend the will of councils before the first arrow flies. Warfare itself looks different. Siege parks assemble with traction trebuchets, counterweight machines, and rams. Specialized units lay wooden roads over marsh to move engines into range. Bombs using early gunpowder mixtures blast gates, set rooftops ablaze, while smoke screens cover sappers as they work. These methods draw on Chinese, Persian, and Central Asian knowledge, combined and fielded at a scale the region had not yet faced. Meanwhile, steppe cavalry stays in motion, slicing relief columns and cutting supply lines until a fortress stands alone. After Genghis Khan, his heirs divide the realm into uluses, each led by a son or grandson. One of those heirs, Hulagu Khan, receives a mandate to bring the remaining powers of Southwest Asia to heel. He advances through the Iranian plateau with siege crews, scribes, and surveyors, folding local forces into his order of battle. Cities surrender or are taken. Citadels that resist serve as warnings to the next. He aims for the heart of the old world, Baghdad, still famed for its libraries, hospitals, and the authority of its caliph. As his armies close on the Tigris, the contrast sharpens. Within the walls, scholars continue their routines. Markets sell paper and spices, and copyists prepare bindings. Outside, earthworks rise, bridges float into place, and engines roll forward. The Caliph seeks terms that cannot hold back a force built for total submission. Trade routes that once converged on the city now bring scouts and artillery crews. The network that carried books and instruments delivers the tools of siege. Reports from the march include a quieter note. Mongol commanders consult astronomers for calendars and navigation, adding Islamic instruments and maps to their kit. Even as the storm builds, the reach of earlier science shows in the gear strapped to saddles and packed in chests. The year 1258 waits ahead, and with it, a break in the chain that linked institutions for centuries. The ground is set, the approaches are measured, and the gates of Baghdad come into view. The siege begins in late January 1258. Earthworks rise beyond the canals, pontoon bridges bind both banks of the Tigris, and siege engines move into fixed parks that can work day and night. For Baghdad, once the clearinghouse of manuscripts and instruments, this is a new kind of pressure, systematic, coordinated, and designed to deny relief. Supplies inside the walls stretch, while outside, scouts cut roads and orchards to keep approach lanes open. The ring tightens until no messenger can slip through. Hulagu Khan's army operates at a scale the region has not faced in generations. Cavalry screens the siege lines, heavy crews build and repair trebuchets, sappers mine against towers, and a command lattice keeps each wing informed. Estimates put their total in the hundreds of thousands when allies, laborers, and camp followers are counted. The force surrounds the city in layers, so even a successful sortie only meets fresh ranks. What had been the jewel of the Abbasid world becomes a target measured in angles and ranges. In the palace, Caliph al-Mustasim hesitates between negotiation and defense. He sends envoys, recalls garrisons too late, and leans on advice that underrates the danger. The Chancery drafts letters seeking terms, while quartermasters tally dwindling grain. The uncertainty costs days. Days matter when engines roll closer. By the time the gates are barred in earnest, the besiegers have secured the bridges and emplaced their heaviest machines within killing distance of the battlements. The breach follows concentrated work. Counterweight trebuchets throw stones that shatter parapets. Rams find seams. Fires take hold where roofs meet walls. Once an opening widens, disciplined units pour through and fan out to choke streets and crossroads. What begins as a collapse at the edge becomes a rush that reaches the heart. For 7 days, flames leap across districts as storehouses, markets, and homes feed the fire. Sounds of flight and fighting mix with falling timbers. The scale of loss is stark. The House of Wisdom and other libraries burn. Instruments melt. Catalogs and commentaries vanish in the smoke. Copyists, jurists, physicians, and astronomers, many die where they kept their work. Reports say the Tigris runs black with ink from dumped books and red with blood from the slaughter. A city that held more than 1 million people shrinks to a fraction within weeks, its bridges broken, its quarters unrecognizable. This defeat ends more than a dynasty's rule. The networks that carried texts, funded scholars, and trained physicians fracture. Hospitals lose endowments, observatories lose staff, workshops that made paper, glass, and brass fittings close. The blow lands on the system that had linked research, teaching, and practice, turning a regional capital into a continental center. With Baghdad silent, knowledge seeks other anchors. Shock ripples outward. In Cairo, Damascus, and Aleppo, rulers review walls, arsenals, and alliances. In Anatolia and the Maghreb, courts read the news with a mix of fear and opportunism. Trade routes adjust, steering caravans towards safer hubs. Some scholars and craftsmen flee ahead of the storm, carrying skills and partial libraries to new patrons. Their arrival seeds circles that restore teaching schedules, rebuild toolkits, and restart copying. The city's domes collapse, smoke dulls the river, and then the noise falls away. What remains is ash, broken stone, and a quiet that follows centuries of talk. In time, parts of the conquering elite convert to Islam, sponsor repairs, and support schools, a small sign that ideas still travel even after walls fail. The age that had gathered so much knowledge closes here, and the next chapters begin along different roads. After Baghdad's fall, the work did not vanish. It migrated. Scholars and craftsmen carried methods, instruments, and partial libraries to safer courts, and their students kept teaching schedules alive. The spirit that drove translation, experimentation, and commentary persisted as a habit of organized knowledge. Endowments in Cairo, Damascus, and Anatolia funded hospitals, observatories, and colleges that adopted familiar workflows, collect texts, standardize instruction, test results in practice, and preserve the record for the next cohort. Knowledge moved west through stable gateways. In Iberia, translation circles in Toledo moved Arabic scientific and philosophical texts into Latin, and scribes reissued them across European schools. Sicily offered another bridge, where administrators trained in Arabic chancery culture met Latin clerics and Greek scholars. Even the Crusader states, despite conflict, acted as conduits for instruments and tables that navigators and physicians found useful. By the 14th century, European universities taught materials that had passed through Arabic commentary, changing how students learned logic, medicine, and astronomy. Much of the classical world returned to Europe by way of Muslim readers who had preserved, corrected, and expanded it. Works of Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy reappeared with annotations, alternate readings, and new proofs. Algebra provided a general language for solving problems beyond geometry. Its algorithmic procedures later fed into calculation, accounting, and, centuries on, computer science. Hospital manuals described case histories, quarantine during outbreaks, and drug testing with controlled observation, giving Western medicine routines it would formalize over time. Optical theory, rebuilt from the ground up, treated light, reflection, and refraction as measurable phenomena, a base that later physicists extended with lenses and wave models. Institutions kept the flames steady. Al-Azhar in Cairo matured into a continuous teaching center, financing professors and students through endowments that outlived dynasties. Further east, Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal courts supported colleges, hospitals, and workshops that maintained curricula in law, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Observatories from Samarkand to Istanbul compiled star catalogs and astronomical tables that corrected earlier values and improved navigation. Standardized instruments, astrolabes, quadrants, and celestial globes circulated alongside the books that taught their use. Seafaring absorbed these skills and pushed them onto new oceans. Navigators tracked monsoon cycles with updated tables, used compasses for bearings, and checked latitude by star altitudes measured with improved sights. Portolan-style notes grew into practical pilot's manuals. When European fleets expanded into the Atlantic and around Africa, they sailed with charts, instruments, and trigonomic methods that had matured in Arabic and Persian treatises. Cartographers combined coastal surveys with astronomical fixes, turning long voyages into repeatable routes that connected markets on a planetary scale. Philosophical debate traveled with the texts. Vincina's distinctions in metaphysics clarified discussions of essence and existence in Latin schools. Averroes' commentaries sharpened readings of Aristotle and raised questions about reason and revelation that scholastics addressed for generations. Al-Ghazali's analyses of certainty, causation, and moral psychology influenced ethics and epistemology across confessional lines. The point was not a single doctrine, but a disciplined way to ask and answer questions with shared tools. The Islamic Golden Age wasn't just history, it was humanity's brightest spark. From Baghdad to Cordoba, knowledge became the true power that shaped our world. If this journey inspired you, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you never miss more stories from the past that built our future.